who is the devil for you? I mean, you've got, we've talked about what it is academically, even for ministry stuff, but like, how has this impacted, what do you think Satan is? What's your personal view? Is there some sort of weird, like, relationship that you've developed there where, you insult Satan or something like that? What's your dynamic with Satan? Thank you so much for joining us, Reverend Dr. Gabrielle Thomas. And even though you're so credentialed and your name is such a mouthful, you generously said that we can refer to you as Reverend Dr. Gabby, which I appreciate. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Reverend Dr. Gabby.
It's great. My pleasure.
Well, we're excited, and we're just going to dive right into it. You've said that studying Satan wasn't your original plan. I mean, you didn't grow up thinking one day I want to be an expert on the devil, did you?
I really didn't, no.
So what happened? What drew you towards this topic? So
it was a reasonably sort of windy way in, actually. For my PhD, I was looking at 4th century Christian theology. So that's where I live most of the time, is in the 4th century. I guess you would call me a historical theologian. And I was researching what Gregory of Nazianzus, who we can talk a bit about later, was saying about what it means to be human, what it means to be made according to the image of God. And as I was working through all of his work, I began to notice a pattern whereby often when he talked about humans as the image of God, he would also bring in Satan. And I was just like, gosh, this is really interesting. I wonder what's going on here, to the point where I had spreadsheets sort of identifying when it was happening, when it wasn't happening, because I was just like, this is really interesting. The PhD itself and that particular research itself wasn't really about Satan per se. So I ended up just generating lots and lots of ideas and work and questions really about Satan, which I then returned to later because they weren't easily resolvable. And to be honest, the more I go on, the more questions I have, right? This is the world of research. So, but that was how I got there. I was going to write about beautiful things about being human.
That's really awesome. But I want to dive into a fun topic that I thoroughly enjoy, which is horror movies. And you've talked some about The Exorcist, that famous movie. So I want to just bring up that topic and just ask, when people bring up Satan in horror movies, he often makes a guest appearance every now and then, What's worth actually taking seriously?
I love that she's like framed this as a deep academic discussion. Like, she's a very legitimate scholar. And we're like, tell us about the movie The Exorcist.
We just did a couple movie reviews, so that's fresh on my mind.
So I have to, full disclosure, I have read the book, but I am not brave enough to watch the movie. So I have not actually sat through the movie because I'm very squeamish. But I did read the book and I thought it was fascinating. So why do I get asked about it? I think it's really interesting. I get asked a lot whenever it's Halloween. I suddenly will get press emailing me and saying, oh, you work on Satan, you must understand about Halloween and The Exorcist. And it's like, well, actually, I sort of live in the 4th century, but I think there's a useful connection to be made in the sense that I think often what those kinds of films and books are expressing is the idea that there's an instinct about evil that it isn't always easy to make sense of and it isn't easy to summarize, but we want to say something. We want to try and grapple with it and understand it in some kind of way. And I think, to be perfectly honest, whilst, yes, reading Greek texts on Satan in the 4th century is a bit different from reading The Exorcist, in a sense, they're asking quite similar questions because they're sort of asking what's going on here. How do we understand how the extraordinary kind of evil happens? Is there anything that can help us when we think about this figure? I think for me, what sends it off track is, I'm a Christian and also a Christian theologian. And so for me, when I'm working and thinking about Satan, I'm doing it in the context of salvation history a lot of the time. And I think the movies and the books, when written from a different perspective, possibly, I think depending on the perspective you're asking the questions from, you're going to be searching for different kinds of answers. So I think it's both helpful and unhelpful, because it is there's similarities and differences between that and then what I'm thinking through.
Okay. Well, I mean, you brought in salvation history and extraordinary suffering and these types of questions. I mean, is the devil a useful way to address the problem of evil, or is the devil a problem in his own right, or is he even the problem? What's the relationship there?
This is such a good question, Jonathan, because I think certainly when it comes to the kind of period that I'm dealing with, a lot of the modern commentaries that I read will say things like the early Christians invented Satan because they didn't really understand evil, and it was a way of saying this is why evil happens in the world. Now we have other ways of understanding what's going on. We have scientific explanations for various things. And so we don't need to worry about that anymore. A bit like germs, we know where germs come from. So, we have ways of handling them that are different now. But actually what I found, and this was the thing that was most surprising to me, because that is such a common narrative that, if you look at Satan, this is where it comes from. He's the sort of king of evil kind of thing. And if we think there's another king of evil or another way of understanding evil, then we don't need Satan. He can disappear out of the story. But when I read the texts, actually, he's not their solution. So I read through sort of, they do the sort of fathers that I'm reading. They write loads and loads of homilies in response to a famine that happened. And it was a really, really serious one in the 4th century where, it sounds as though hundreds of people died of starvation. And they're sort of thinking through, why is this happening? What's going on? And what fascinated me most reading those homilies is Satan's not in them. So it's not a sense of, oh, this happened because there's this horrible character out there and we think it's his fault. They have other ways of thinking theologically about it that don't involve Satan at all. Now, there are ways that in the contemporary world, most people wouldn't really be on board with, so that it's not necessarily they provide great answers otherwise, but what they're not doing is sitting there and saying all evil happens because of this particular character. So in that sense, he's not helpful when we're thinking through sort of evil in the sense of famines and disasters of sort of sometimes natural things that happen, for example. I think where he can be helpful is thinking through, or where we sort of see him most in the early Christian text, is when you're thinking through questions of temptation and wrongdoing, when humans are harming each other, that kind of thing. That tends to be where they engage the thought on him the most. Yeah.
So just to clarify, so they don't connect Satan at all with these famines, but
No.
mostly with temptation.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
I should have just said that, actually, Seth.
No. I'm just
that's absolutely right.
My 2-year-old, we're taking him off a pacifier, so I'm going on about a couple hours of sleep. So yeah, blame me for any comprehension questions. But I feel like, like speaking of comprehension questions, we brought up Gregory of Nazianzus, which just might be who the heck is this guy? And, who are the Cappadocians and these other figures? Can you give us some background on these figures and a little bit more about what they generally thought about this guy, Satan?
Sure, yeah. So he's Gregory of Nazianzus. I discovered him when I was looking for books in a library to write an essay. And I figured that I would choose basically a father that nobody had heard of in the seminary that I was working in. This is like 15 years ago. And so I didn't really know anything about him and started reading his writing. The three of them, so there's 2 brothers, Gregory of Nyssa and Basil of Caesarea, and then their friend Gregory of Nazianzus. And the 3 of them, along with these days as well, Macrina, who is also the sister of Basil and Gregory of Nyssa, tend to be grouped together as the Cappadocians because of the region that they were around in, which was modern-day Turkey. That was Cappadocia. And they were involved with all of the debates around the doctrine of God in the 4th century. So when the church didn't still really have, not that we have a full and perfect picture today of God, but when the church was really asking questions about how do we sort of describe God, or how do we find a grammar for God that makes sense and is authentic to what we think scripture is saying, that kind of thing. They were heavily involved in those debates, but they were also pastors and bishops as well. And so you've got that conversation going on the whole time between what do we think is an appropriate way to speak about God, and also how do we speak about that with our congregations. So you've got a really interesting translation going on between sort of some really technical theology and also some pastoral care, which was one of the things I really appreciated about them. So when they're talking about Satan, they think about him as a fallen angel, but they don't stick to one story around how he fell. So it's not simply that they have one narrative whereby Satan decided to go against God and then was cast to earth. They sort of give different explanations around why Satan was cast down to earth. So in one place, we'll find them describing that Satan really didn't want to do what he was being told with regard to human beings, and that was why he was cast out. And then in other places it's more that it looks like he just rose up against God because he wanted to be better. And that's the thing I find interesting, that between the three of them they don't always agree on everything. So there's not one simple story other than that he was a fallen angel. That's basically as concise as you can get, because there's lots of different nuances once he's fallen about what he can do and also what will happen to him at the very end of everything.
Just as a follow-up, what did God ask Satan to do that he wouldn't do?
To go down and worship human beings, because we'd been made in God's image.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it comes from it. It's a really fascinating sort of just extra biblical text called The Life of Adam and Eve. Genuinely one of the most interesting texts I've ever encountered. And it's a conversation. It exists, oh my goodness, in Coptic, Syriac, Greek, Latin, Armenian, like loads of different traditions of it. But there's this one example where Michael basically said to Satan, you have to go, and we all have to, as the angels, go and worship this human being because God's made it in God's image, and so God's image must be adored. And Satan's basically, well, no, why would I do that? I was created first and I'm far more glorious. I'm not going to lower myself to that. And because that act of disobedience is cast out of God's presence.
Well,
it's a very fun story.
This is really interesting because, I mean, we're talking about angels and then we're getting to Satan here. And I think that's part of the sort of pattern in your work, and perhaps in the Cappadocians themselves, where we have to begin with angels and then pivot to the devil discussion, which is interesting just as a move, but it's also interesting because your name, Gabrielle, or previously Gabriel, I guess you fell and became Gabby. But
I love that.
But
don't insult our guests.
What?
It's actually very funny.
See, Seth, she approves. Thank you. Not fallen at all. Why do you start with angels and then to the devil? What did we achieved with that move?
Sure, it's a really good question, because a lot of the kinds of moves that I now make, I didn't always just make, right? They sort of came through studying, really. So because of the text that I'm working with, it's hard to just so none of the sort of three or four of them ever actually sit there and say Satan is X, Y, and Z, and you can understand him by knowing X, Y, and Z. So you really have to piece together through reading everything what it is they really thought he was able to do, how far he could go, what he was responsible, what we're responsible for. And the more I read, the more I began to understand that if you understand what they think about angels, and how angels are invisible, but they still are made of material stuff, so they're embodied, even though they describe them as bodiless, they're actually not technically bodiless. So it's sort of okay, so they actually thought these beings were real. They were actually real things, not metaphors, not just ways of describing something. They were, these invisible beings sort of going through the cosmos. Once you study what they thought about angels and then begin to look at what they say about Satan, it becomes clear that everything a good angel does, so you get guardian angels, you get angels of the nations, you get angels supporting the church, you get angels rejoicing when someone's baptized, you get angels ministering to Jesus, angels glorifying God because fundamentally they're created for worship and that kind of thing, and so they support human worship too. Once you see all of that, you can begin to sort of predict a little bit how they're going to describe Satan's activities, because it's usually the opposite of what he should have been doing if he hadn't fallen. So in the way that you would expect humans to be encouraged to worship, wherever there's idolatry, you will see some kind of semblance of Satan going on. And so it's literally all the exact opposite moves, because the way they understand him is whilst he has a will, he can only really act in contradiction to what he was already. Yeah, does that make sense?
So,
Yeah.
so basically, it's sort of a dark, I don't want to say parody, but antithesis to the angelic powers, where the angelic powers are leading nations and the church and helping Jesus. And so Satan and his minions are doing like,
For sure.
well, when they fell, it's like, oh, it's like a negative sign is put in the front of it. They have to do the exact opposite.
Yeah. And so the idea and the goal is really to destroy all human flourishing, given
Gotcha.
that's what the angels are part of supporting, all for the glory of God, right? Because I mean, these are theologians who are writing ultimately for the glory of God all the time and pointing all of us towards that. So anything that's going to detract from worship, you will see that's where they then talk about Satan and that kind of thing.
Okay.
That word. Go ahead, Seth.
I was gonna say, does that connect at all to the names of Satan? Because you mentioned there's like 50 of them. Are these in
Yeah.
some sense like ways to talk about the different ways that Satan takes away from the worship of God, or like what are they doing? What are these names doing?
Oh, this was so fascinating to me because originally there's sort of websites you can use, wonderful technology that we have, where you can put in a Greek word and then you'll simply find all the text that that Greek word appears in. And so I started off by researching, doing word searches on Satan and devil and thinking, oh, he's, pretty prevalent, but not as prevalent as I might have thought he was. And then I sort of stopped that and then started just actually reading the text and then realized that actually he was everywhere, but it wasn't always obvious because some of the names, when they're translated in English, people don't capitalize it. I mean, fair enough, but it's not always then obvious that actually what you're reading in English, that the Greek text is pointing to this Satan figure. And so, or sometimes you'll have fakes translating evil when it's actually evil one, and he's talking about the devil. And so you get sort of all these nuances in translation. So I think for me, what the names did was help me understand they talk about him a lot more than I could have possibly appreciated. He's prevalent in their thought. But they're mostly describing his activities. So he's the deceiver, he's the tempter, he's the antagonist, he's the opponent, he's the murderer, he's death, but not always death, because sometimes death is death. So that's always a fun one to work out. Sometimes he's envy, but again, not always envy, because sometimes envy is envy. And so there's a lot of work in translation trying to work out, and sometimes you just can't, but I do my best to work out, are they talking about him here or are they talking about something else? You can, for the most part, you can usually sort of get it. But sometimes it's ambiguous. And I often wonder if that ambiguousness is left on purpose, because actually the king of envy, it isn't wholly unlikely that he is related to envy in some way. So there's all these sort of things that hang around the names in the background. I have got some personal favorites, Seth, if you're interested.
Very
So
much so.
The best one I ever came across, and my friends translated this text. It's from a series of homilies on the Lord's Prayer, and they refer to him as the subterranean one. I was like, wow, what a fascinating name. And they get the Greek from, it's katakthonios, and it's basically from the Philippians passage where that hymn, whoever wrote it, I won't get into that now, basically talks about every knee bowing to Christ, the things above the earth, on the earth, and under the earth. And so you've got that same word, and they then take that as a name for the devil. So you're sort of left with this question, and this is Gregory of Nyssa. Does that mean he envisages the devil ultimately bowing down to Christ? Possibly, because that's where he gets that name from. He doesn't go through and say that explicitly in the homily, but it's sort of what sort of sits around in the back of my mind, given how he sits on that in other places. You could translate it, so in the French it's translated as infernal one, but I'm always a bit cautious about that one because it then brings up so many medieval ideas of hell. And of course, this is a long, long time, the 4th century, we're way before the medieval period here. So they're not giving those kinds of, at least these texts that I'm reading, it's elsewhere, but they're not giving the kind of descriptions of hell that are as vivid as we would get in someone like Dante or something like that. So subterranean one I really love because it's vivid and it captures something that I think's quite fun and helpful. But also there's another one that appears in a poem by Gregory of Nazianzus, and he calls him the destroyer of the image. And it's a really just like vibrant, oh, you destroyer of the image, because he's actually talking to him to try and get him to go away. And it's the idea that he's the person or the thing, the angel that destroys the human being that's made according to the image of God, which is what we find in Genesis. So destroyer of the image and subterranean one, I think, are evocative, but also give an idea of what they thought his purpose was, really, and what his overall project was.
Well, this is so interesting because he's all these different names and things. Is he death? Is he envy? Is he? I guess the real question is, practically speaking, where is the devil at work and where is he not? Like, should we go hunting for the devil in almost every scary event at this point? Where do you actually locate the devil's activity?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really helpful question, because I think, first of all, before I even answer that, I would say that I personally wouldn't profess to be able to locate every single activity of the devil, just to full disclosure. Because I am not the priest in The Exorcist, right? So this is, yeah. So I think in all seriousness is that it's not always as apparent and clear as we'd want it to be, and that's certainly the impression that they give, because it's a process of discernment. So it's not a case of this character pops up and is there in your face going, haha, I'm the devil. They talk about him a lot as wearing masks. And so sometimes it could appear very innocent and beautiful, but actually isn't. And so just requires a process, I would say, first of all, in terms of how you work it out, discernment. So definitely not in every scary event. I think it's when you can see dehumanization at work. Because if you think about the way that he's named and his overall project is to stop human flourishing, then anything that involves humans being made less than human is going to be potentially somewhere where you might see him at work. And then again, for them, it's a lot of the time the conversation is located on the church, because he's definitely a big enemy of the church, because the church is there to shine God's love and share God's love and do God's work in the world, and he doesn't want that happening. So I think sometimes you could possibly see it then with respect to when the kind of really nasty, fractious arguments are going on in the church, in terms of when people are being really, really vile to one another. That's the kind of ways that they would be beginning to discern Satan at work. But it wouldn't necessarily be quite as vividly displayed as in like the movie back at the beginning we were talking about.
Darn, that's a good movie. So as you're talking about that, though, I'm thinking about
A real
the
head
agency.
turner.
I'm thinking about the agency of Satan and that fun common saying, "The devil made me do it."
Yeah.
And I mean, in scripture, you got like James saying, each one of us sins when by our own evil desires. He doesn't reference Satan at all. But there's
Yeah,
other parts where it's like, Peter says, the devil is like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And so
yeah,
there's like a competing image here. It's like, how do you wrestle with this idea of, humans are responsible for their sin, but Satan's
yep.
also there, causing it as well.
It's such a good question because I think for them, it's almost like if you imagined a drama on a stage and you had three actors, you've got human beings, so sort of like the whole of humankind, you've got God and you've got Satan. And I think they see that as a conversation as opposed to just humans and God or just Satan and God. So there's definitely some kind of interaction going on. That means that certainly as far as the Cappadocians were concerned, if you are worshipping God, if you're seeking to follow God, then you're under God's rule, under God's law, under God's care. And that doesn't mean, though, that you're not going to be attacked by Satan and his minions, but it's up to you to resist. So the attacks will still keep coming regardless. But you have the responsibility to either say no or yes. When you come a little later, there's a super theologian called Evagrius who wrote a book called Talking Back. And it's basically a description, it's a handbook really, for how to resist temptation and how to resist Satan when he comes with his various minions. And he sort of goes through the different work of the demons and how you might push back. He's got over 500 Bible verses that he uses to describe how you can resist. So it's that kind of sense of, well, he's here in the world for now, and that means it's our responsibility to resist him. So we can't ever say he made us do it, because we have a certain degree of freedom, even though he's ruling for a season. Because you've got this funny juxtaposition between on the one hand, he's the ruler of the world, but on the other hand, Christ has defeated him. And so you've got this continual tension between living in Christ's victory, whilst also at the moment, we don't see the fullness of that completely. And for them, that's resolved, I guess in Christian speak, we'd call it eschatologically, in everybody else's terms, at the end of time.
Well, I've loved kind of this picture of the Cappadocian notion of Satan, and it's super helpful. I wonder, and I'm just springing this question on you. This isn't in the notes, but could you maybe give a broader sense of how Satan, our views of Satan have evolved, just very broadly, of course, over the last, few thousand years? Like, what are the major trends, and
Sure.
how do we get the picture we have today of Satan? If you could kind of give us that bigger picture of how these things evolve.
By all means, Jonathan, but when you say the picture we have today, which picture do you refer to?
Well, that's a great question for you to answer in your answer.
Yeah, I mean,
because there are lots of Satans, right?
Yeah,
so
sure.
Yeah,
maybe just the standard picture
legion.
of, they're a legion. The standard picture of he's a fallen angel, the king of hell, the Paradise Lost version, I guess, that sort of dominates so many people's imagination. Maybe that version. I don't know. That seems to be the big one, right?
Well, it makes just the competing visions. Yeah. How do these different visions come to the fore?
So, in terms of the competing visions, what's really interesting, I think one of the most really interesting things to happen was through the Enlightenment and the process of modernity, we saw a real shift in Christian thought on how to think about Satan. So sort of through to 17th century, you have this image of different strands of the story of how he fell, but you still have this image of a fallen angel. Some of the images will be more connected with hell, some of them will be more connected with earth, depending on the context and the time that folks are thinking about Satan in. But when it really shifts is around sort of through modernity, theologians begin to say, I think we need to do without angels and demons because we're looking ridiculous as Christians here, and we want to look not ridiculous. So we're going to need to do a lot of work on how we interpret these texts, and we're going to need to do a lot of thought about what's necessary to the Christian story and Christian theology and what isn't necessary. And during that process, Satan gets taken out, basically. And you have theologians arguing that it's actually better to just maybe keep him in hymns, keep him in some prayers, that's okay, but we don't actually need him as part of the story. And so then what you end up with is a sort of a relegated figure that's really only then useful or sort of involved with like the arts. And so you'll still see, folks picking up stuff in art, and you'll still see, I've got a super picture of a bronze statue of Satan that's going on my book cover. So you'll still see sort of Satan in the arts world, but a lot less.
Oh, you meant depicted in the arts. I thought you meant like he's behind
Oh,
all this rock and roll nonsense.
Oh no, not at all. No.
I know a few genres that I think he's created.
I mean, I'm sure there were people who would say that. I am definitely not saying that. No. So you've got then really just sort of, I think, a sort of a myth in a sense that for some artists, for sort of some areas, it's useful to think about it with. But what you haven't got is just sort of one clear identified figure throughout Christianity. So, I mean, he remains in the Catechism for Catholics. And so, officially he remains in Catholicism. But, for example, in the Church of England, where I'm ordained, they took out the devil from the baptism vows in it was 2013 or 14. So that you didn't have to have him in there anymore because he was deemed irrelevant. So you could turn up and say, now I renounce evil, but you don't need to say I renounce the devil. Whereas for years and years and years and years, centuries, it was Christians were always saying, I renounce Satan and all his works. And that was a really key part of what it meant to be baptized, that kind of thing. So we've seen lots of shifts and changes, which I think means today there isn't one image. And that's sort of why I ask, which image, because depending on who you ask, Satan is either going to be very relevant or irrelevant. And I think certainly for me, what I was trying to do with the text I was reading was how do you find a balance between those two places where you don't dispense completely with Satan from salvation history, but you also are not someone who's seen Satan in absolutely everything. So like the rock music, for example.
So this is kind of hits on it, but there then seems to be a lot of misunderstandings and myths maybe about the figure of Satan just everywhere. Are there some that you've encountered quite frequently, like misunderstandings or general myths about who Satan is or the history of Satan or anything like that?
I think the biggest one that for me was where we started really in terms of where he connects to the problem of evil and how he really is. That's the only way to understand him is by thinking about why is there evil in the world as opposed to any kind of account of angels. That's my biggest misunderstanding. And then also either how he is completely irrelevant or has too much power. I think that would, but I tend not to encounter those so much working in a university, if I'm honest. Yeah.
Well, I mean, in your academic context, how does that get perceived? Are people fascinated? Are they dismissive? Like, why are you studying Satan?
This is such a good question. I could go on a long rant about this one, actually. So over the course of my career, so I'm thinking I started presenting at conferences on this about 15 years ago. And a friend recently suggested, who's a professor in the university, that she wanted to buy me a T-shirt and get printed on it, I was speaking about the devil before he was trendy, which really made me laugh. And at some point I might hold her to it. So there's been a shift is where I'm getting to. So when I first started talking about this and what I thought I was seeing in the texts, i.e. that he wasn't irrelevant in the 4th century, actually, and there was something very important to how they thought theologically that meant you couldn't really just ignore him. About a decade ago, I was still being extremely dismissed. And on the whole, I would give a paper, and I remember one particular instance where an esteemed and learned colleague came up to me and actually patted me on the shoulder and suggested that I find a more useful research topic because we didn't really need to worry about that anymore. I didn't agree, and whilst I respected the esteemed and learned colleague and carried on pursuing it, what I've noticed nowadays is there's sort of pockets of folks who take it seriously and take my work seriously and are genuinely interested and ask questions, and I get invited to speak about it as someone who just probably knows what they're talking about. Then there's also a small, and it is small, but a sort of a small strand of folks who think that this is a dangerous subject to study, and that by studying Satan, I might somehow be sympathetic to him, which it's studying and sympathy are not the same point, right? I don't either want to worship him or become like him or become his friend. Studying to understand something is very different from sympathetic to, but that's often a common, not often, that it is a fear that I hear projected sometimes. Don't you think that's a bit dangerous? Don't you think you should leave that alone? And I'm sort of like, I don't understand how understanding something deeper is going to make you more vulnerable to it. Ideally, I mean, as far as they were concerned, the bishops and theologians I'm reading, it was going to make you more equipped to resist it, not more likely to take it on. But that's definitely one strand of thought. And I have had a few people write and complain about the fact that I publish on the devil as a Christian priest, because that's not always considered to be an appropriate thing for Christian priests to be talking about.
Speak of the devil and he will come.
Or not.
Or
it's
not.
very
Yeah. I mean, it's the idea, right? You shouldn't speak about him. You're inviting him in.
Yeah,
it's very
so.
incorrect spiritually. This is why we're having you on here, of course.
I have to say, this feels like a very happy home for me in terms of the podcast.
Well, it's funny too. We were interviewing Carlos Eyre, the Yale historian, and he talked a little bit also from his recent work they flew about some of the resistance that he's had as well. But he was.
I'm not surprised. I was on back when I was working at Yale, I was on a supervision committee with him for a PhD. So his work is fantastic.
Yeah, no kidding. Okay, yeah, very lovely gentleman. It's our first conversations. He was incredible to interview. But he spoke about like a hope for a sea change as well. Not just in his work, but like he seemed to be hopeful for that we can at least have these conversations again.
I think there is a real. I feel really. I think hope's a really good word actually, because I do feel really hopeful. I definitely, on the whole, apart from the few pockets here and there, I definitely find more people are genuinely curious and interested and respectful rather than dismissive. There has definitely been, and I'm never sure whether it's because I'm more senior now, does it make any difference once you have tenure and an associate professor and all that kind of thing, and you've published 3 books, I mean, there's a sense to which, you can earn some of the respect, but I don't think it's that. I think that there is genuinely a desire to acknowledge that as humans, we don't absolutely understand every single thing in the world already.
There's this difference you said there in the prayer for deliver us from the evil one and deliver us from evil. Could you talk a bit more on how big of a difference that is and what that leads to? Like, what different worlds are those 2 versions of that prayer?
So this comes from there's 2 theologians, Gregory of Nyssa and Origen of Alexandria. He's a little bit earlier than Gregory of Nyssa. And both of them write different teachings. So one of them writes a set of homilies, that's Gregory of Nyssa, and then Origen writes a treatise on the Lord's Prayer. And as they're working through the different lines and verses, and this is how we should be praying and making sense of it for folks, when they get to deliver us from evil, they don't translate that as deliver us from evil. They translate it as deliver us from the evil one. Now, in the Greek, it could be either. So you can go either way in terms of the technicalities of the Greek. But they choose very clearly to translate deliver us from the evil one. And for them, what the difference is how you then are praying and imagining what that means. So first of all, you're not saying anything that's ever painful or difficult or any kind of suffering, deliver me from it, because you're saying something more specific than just evil. Now, evil, good grief. People are still doing PhDs on what is evil, right? So that's something that can be debated and talked about, and it really could be abstract or could be narrow, but you don't get a lot when you say deliver me from evil compared to when you say deliver me from the evil one. Because evil, if I think evil is hitting my toe, now I'm being, minimizing it on purpose to make my point, but then, actually that might not necessarily need delivering from. When you're talking about delivering from the evil one, you're talking about a very specific understanding of the world in which there's a ruler of it that isn't good and doesn't have human flourishing at the heart of it. So you're really praying, deliver me from everything that will prevent me and every other human from flourishing in a very, very specific way. Deliver me from everything that will prevent me from true worship. Deliver me from everything that's going to sort of tempt me, in a sense, to harm other people. So you've got quite a specificity with it, and I think that's for them why they drilled down on that. Really, is the particular rather than the open. I've actually, because obviously I'm praying the Lord's Prayer when I'm celebrating a Eucharist and when I'm in church and Sundays and then morning prayer, etc. I've found it a really interesting way to shift and pray that and think through, what does that mean? What does it mean for me? What does it mean for the church? It's actually quite a helpful exercise. Also, because I think sometimes making one difference can help us pay attention more, as opposed to just praying something by rote. So yeah, but that's what was going on for them.
So I need to relate this to an experience I had recently, which was I had a student come up and ask me what I thought of Chronicles of Narnia, knowing I'm a huge C.S. Lewis nerd.
Me too.
Yes, good, thank you. I mean, I feel
totally. How can you not be?
Yeah, no kidding.
The more you think about Lewis, the more he thinks about you.
I do think it's a prerequisite for anyone who wants to go into like ministry or Christian theology. Anytime I hear someone doesn't like it, I get a little suspicious of them. But long story short, they asked me the question of the White Witch and the theory of atonement that's presented. Obviously, C.S. Lewis, whether he's actually committing himself to that is debatable. But he presents this story where the White Witch is basically deceived or outwitted or outsmarted by Aslan. And that's a certain theory of atonement about Satan, right? That Satan was somehow tricked into killing Jesus. And aha, got you now, because that's the very method I'm using for atonement. What do you think of that story? Is there a better story to tell? Is there goods in it, bads in it? What are your thoughts?
Oh my gosh, I have so many thoughts because I have a whole chapter on chapter 4 of the book that's coming out in the summer is literally on that very question, Seth. And I think I spent 6 months, I won't go into this in too much depth because I might bore you, but oh my gosh, the stuff around, so in the 4th century it's presented as a fish hook. So Jesus hooked the devil in and, or God hooked the devil in and caught him kind of thing. And I spent about 6 weeks reading about ancient ideas of fishing, and it was just fascinating because there's a whole world that kind of, I'm going to not call it a theory because it definitely wasn't in the 4th century, but that kind of idea came out of, that you really do need to understand the ancient world it was in to make sense of what they were actually saying and doing. So yes, I think there are some goods in it. I think how it's helpful maybe for us today, given that we're not in the 4th century and we don't have manuals on fishing to turn to for guidance and that kind of thing on what that might look like. I think a helpful way to think about it is if we think about Satan as a hugely arrogant fallen angel, because he just thinks he's better than everyone else and deserves everything, right? All the worship, all the glory, all the fame. Someone that arrogant is very unlikely to recognize the beauty and truth that is the Son of God. They might see there's something, maybe, but to really fully understand that God could possibly condescend to become human is actually, that takes a level of some kind of grasp of humility, I think, that as far as we would see from all of the different accounts of him, Satan doesn't have. So I think it doesn't necessarily need to be construed as Satan God directly deceived Satan because he needed to in any way, shape, or form. But also we can think of it that Satan failed to recognize God in Christ because he literally wouldn't have been capable of discerning Christ, not in quite in the same way, especially not before Christ had died and risen. Because obviously you have the crucifixion, you have the death, and then you have a resurrection. And it's really only in a resurrection, and you sort of have that with Aslan a little bit as well, that it's very fully clear that this is God. And so it's not necessarily, I think, that we need to think of it as therefore Satan was deceived or the devil was deceived, but that it was basically when he was really able to see who Christ was, it was too late. Possibly.
So God's not devious. Satan is a dum-dum. Is kind of.
I think he was an incredibly intelligent being, but he wasn't omnipotent. He isn't omnipotent, right?
And it's like that one verse, had they known, they would not have crucified the Lord of Glory. I'm butchering the verse, but I think you know what I'm talking about.
I do, yeah. It's very possible that not everything was revealed to him until that absolutely critical moment of resurrection happens. Because that's really when you do know God has defeated death, right?
Yeah. This also relates, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I mean, I also think it relates very much to atonement models. I heard David Bentley Hart talking about New Testament atonement stuff, and he seemed to be moving away from a lot of more, like substitutionary type stuff, or even ransom stuff. He and emphasizing more the spiritual hierarchies and beings, and that those are what Christ defeated and accomplished. And I wonder, I mean, it is recapturing some of that, perhaps not in a mutually exclusive way to traditional atonement theories, the way that some have, but recapturing that. I mean, that feels more Christus Victor in a way we might have lost as well. Like Satan, demons, those are, Jesus actually goes and he but
yeah, I mean, for a very long time, that was a cool way of understanding what was going on, right? And things die out, get argued out, that kind of thing. I mean, it doesn't surprise me that he's also saying that because he would be reading the same people that I'm reading, right? So we both work on Gregory of Nyssa, and you really do see that coming very clearly through Gregory of Nyssa. I think a lot of what I enjoy doing is recovering some of the things that I guess it's sort of, when I'm thinking about what I'm doing with these ancient ideas, is it's almost like treasure hunting, really, and seeing what you can find, seeing what does translate, what doesn't translate, and how much interpretation work needs to be done in order to make something make sense. Because as I say, the fishing metaphor makes so much more sense once you've read all the handbooks on fishing and how wily fish are and what really is going on when someone catches a fish, and how you have to be a little bit deceitful if you're a fisherman because you can't catch fish otherwise. Like, it's really fascinating. And I think a lot of that doesn't always translate naturally, but I think there's definitely strands of ancient wisdom that we can pull, that do pull through to today, really well and really helpfully.
So this is all super awesome, but I'm going to ask you, we've been sort of had our academic hats on quite a bit. And I asked us
Sure.
to take that off for a second. I'm just curious for you, as you're doing this academic study, you know, Monday through Friday, but then Sunday comes along and then you have to serve in a ministerial role. When you put on that ministerial hat, have you noticed that your studies have been affected at all? Or that your ministerial work has been affected at all by your studies?
100% yes. Yeah. Because I don't see vocation as, I'm really glad you raised this actually, Seth, because I've never seen it that I am an academic and then I'm a priest at weekends. I'm always a priest and I'm always a scholar, because both of those things I was called to as a scholar priest, sort of in one vocation. And so there's never one or the other. Sometimes there's a tension depending on time, because we still only have 24 hours in a day, sadly. But in terms of how I understand the overall vocation that I think I was called to by God, I really do see it as one thing. So they have to feed into each other, otherwise there'd be no point for me. Where I've seen it certainly very obviously filtering through, and where my congregation would say it filters through, is so, for example, in Advent, we have this ancient tradition called the Four Last Things, where you preach on, I might not get the order right now, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. And for years, the church, because the readings in Advent in the Catholic Church, Church of England, and I'm sure many, many other traditions, focus around Jesus coming, but also Jesus coming back. You have this really apocalyptic set of readings during Advent. And I decided, okay, well, I'm thinking about all these things at school, so actually maybe I preach on them as well. And so I preached on hell for the first time. It was about 3 years ago now. And it felt like a really bold move, because I'm in an Episcopal church and we don't actually spend lots of time talking and preaching about hell in my parish. And I have never had so much feedback over a sermon as I did on that, because it turns out it's something I think that we don't talk about, but that doesn't mean we don't think about it, right? And it doesn't mean we don't worry about it just because we don't name it. So I think what it's done for me is given me an intellectual capacity, because I now have a set of skills to be able to think about then, how do I preach on these things with integrity and with care? How do I dispel some of the more damaging myths and harms in which some of these ideas have been presented? And how do I talk about it seriously? So it's affected preaching. Everyone in my parish knows that I've written this book because I've done nothing but talk about it for 5 years now, because research takes a long time. So I've been writing it for 5 years, and I've been in Atlanta for 5 years. And so this whole time I've been talking about writing this book. And so there's a sense to which it's part of the conversations, it's part of how I'm thinking, it's part of what I'm speaking about. And so that tends to be where you sort of see it filtering through. I haven't yet taught a course on it in the parish, because I wanted to wait until I really matured the ideas, so that I'm basically not doing harm, right? Because these are really sensitive subjects and you want to handle it carefully. But what I'm doing this semester is teaching a course on the devil in early Christian thought. And that's quite fun doing that at school, because it's a sort of nice way of thinking through the ideas with students in a seminary.
Well, thank you so much for coming on here. This has been a wonderful, very, intellectual, academic, getting into the Cappadocian pictures and what different theologians have thought about the devil. And you've sort of hinted at this, but I wanted to ask, who is the devil for you? I mean, you've got, we've talked about what it is academically, even for ministry stuff, but like, how has this impacted, what do you think Satan is? What's your personal view? Is there some sort of weird, like, relationship that you've developed there where, you insult Satan or something like that? What's your dynamic with Satan?
Such a good question. I love you for asking that. I have got to a place, and this is after many, many, many years of thought, but what I want to say before I say it is this is not my final word, because I don't plan to stop thinking, right? So you might find I answer slightly differently if we were to have this conversation in 10 years' time, maybe. But where I've come to now is I think of Satan as a persona. So not a person, because I think personhood is the wrong category to think about something that diabolic, but a persona. And a persona that can be discerned at times and at other times remains hidden. So almost like a mask that doesn't have a face behind it, but that there's something there that sort of reasonably unsettling in terms of evil.
That's haunting. A
But
mask with no face there. Jeez.
But not undefeated, because I fundamentally am, like I'm a Christian, right? So not at least to just, come up and hit me in the face or anything like that. So not undefeated, but still a persona that I need to take seriously. And that's sort of as far as I have gotten. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a haunting image. And honestly,
I didn't mean to leave you with a, sleep well tonight, guys.
Wonderful. That's a wonderful way to close this out. Thank you so much. Just as a sort of final pitch, where can people find out more from you, the book, anything you want to direct someone to?
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. So there's going to be 2 books because there was more than I can say in one book. The first book is out this summer. It's published with Cambridge University Press, so you can find it on their website. It's called The Problem of the Devil in Cappadocian Thought. And I use that title because I'm playing on the problem of evil, and I'm suggesting it's actually the problem of the devil. So that's the first one. And the second one I've started writing, but it will be out in a few years' time. And that is going to be called I Renounce Satan and All His Works. And it's why we should still renounce Satan today at baptism.
Well, I mean, the whole time I just kept having all these cultural references go off in my head. Like I had Sympathy for the Devil by Rolling Stones playing in the background, like, "Wow, what's my name?" And I kept trying to come up with puns like, does the devil wear Prada? But then they weren't good enough to actually share. And I'm sure she's heard all of them. So I refrained, which I think was good. But the interesting thing.
What was going through my head this whole time is I wonder what it's like for Jonathan to hear his own biography spoken back to him.
Hey, that's not very sympathetic for this demon, for this devil.
I don't listen to music from before I am born. I'm sorry.
Get you behind me, Satan. But what I thought was so interesting is when she was talking about in modernity, this move away from sort of an anthropomorphic version of Satan as an actual entity like us. Because I see that as very much the whole process of modernity itself is trying to get at some sort of objective knowledge that exists apart from the human element or filter or our bias. So, right, like there can't be a God because that's just a projection of ourselves onto the clouds. There can't be a Satan because that's just a projection of our human form onto the underworld. But what I think modernity ends up doing is sort of eating itself and turning that critique on itself, right? Because then, okay, well, morality and aesthetics, those aren't real things in the world itself. Those are just human ideas that we've projected onto reality. Reality is just atoms swirling in a void. But then that kind of gets turned on science itself, right? Like Thomas Kuhn's kind of critique is that we are projecting our human reason onto the world and then see, like, is any knowledge or truth actually out there in the world, or is it all just a projection? And this is where postmodernity comes in, right? And if we're going to reject
real
that,
crazy with this in your mind, didn't you?
No, but then if we reject the idea that all truth and thought is just a projection of our own brain categories onto the world, and accept that maybe there's something about our humanity that actually points to reality as it is, why not go all the way back and then re-embrace a very anthropomorphic Satan and a very anthropomorphic God, right? Like everything's back on the table once you open the door a little bit. I
Yeah, I
don't know.
mean, yeah, I actually wrote an article on this, on why.
Of course you did.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm gonna self-promote any chance I get, right? That's the whole podcast is self-promotion, John. Why
Pursuit of self.
did this become so unpopular? Why is it unpopular? I mean, if you just begin to think about it, the possibility that there are other intelligent entities out there that have impacted us throughout the course of salvation history, that's not improbable even in itself. We think of it as so like, oh, yeah, that sounds crazy, right? Where did that idea come from? Like, I mean, if you're just going to look at different cultures, one of the most universally believed things across most cultures is that there are these spiritual beings out there, some of them helpful, some of them malevolent.
Yeah. And you could just say, well, all of our universal human beliefs are stupid and don't point to reality, but why do we do that for these beliefs and not others?
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Like clearly, if you find something that's cross-cultural, something that nearly every culture believes in, maybe pay attention to that, because maybe it's hitting on something, right? And of course, that's the idea is to immediately explain it away. This idea that we over attribute agency to things. Basically, it's like I hear a rustle in the woods behind me, and I immediately run because I think it's a predator. And because I did that, like people who did that are more likely to survive. So over attributing agency has a survival value. And that's this idea that, like, well, okay, so those people left, and they left kids, they passed on their genes. So eventually, everyone's attributing agency to everything.
And
it's just overactive.
And that's valid. But at the same time, if you then say, okay, let's stop running when we hear noises in the woods, maybe you're going to get mauled by a bear, because sometimes there actually is an agent there, right? I mean, it's so like, yeah, maybe we're primed to see God up in the clouds when we look up there, but that doesn't mean he's not there, right? Like just as we're primed to imagine things in the dark in the woods, that doesn't mean there isn't something in the dark in the woods. Like maybe you should run, you know.
Yeah, so, I mean, maybe there is something there. It's not an argument against it just because we see it. And more to the point, like it helps me. There's a beneficial survival value to think that you're a conscious being and not just an NPC. Like everyone else isn't an NPC. Even though I can explain the survival value of assuming that there's minds inside of other people, doesn't mean it's fake. Probably it's true, actually.
I'm just projecting my humanity onto you. You're not a conscious agent. I'm just seeing in you what is in me.
I'm the persona. Yeah. I am the persona.
If you take that projection critique far enough, you end up with solipsism, the view that all that exists is just me and my mind, and everything is just an anthropomorphic projection of my brain and its categories and its spatial, temporal frameworks, and even mathematics isn't real. It's just me projecting my own like way of thinking onto the world, which is a serious thing in a lot of philosophy of mathematics. Philosophers of mathematics don't know if math is real or it's just in here. Are we just projecting it? And if we're not, well, then Satan exists. I've proven it, Seth. Solved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, after all the conversations we've had with Shane Wood, I don't think I needed much more proof. I don't think I needed math to come in and help.
Wow, I've never really considered him Satan, but it is interesting. In the episode we did with him, Seth did reveal that his mom briefly told him he could be the Antichrist. So maybe you're Satan. Get behind me, Satan.
Well,
get behind me.
This wasn't a joke on Shane. I was talking about our Halloween episode. Remember that?
I don't remember anything, man. I'm so tired.
We had told all the stories we couldn't explain, right? All the demonic stuff, right? Yeah. No, like these stories. I feel like even in the church, we feel awkward to talk about.
Yeah, we're embarrassed. Like you sound stupid if you talk about it.
Well, after we were done recording, we talking to Dr. Thomas, she shared with us a miraculous event in her own life. With hopefully we can get her back on. She's agreed. Hopefully we can find a time to get her back on to talk about. No spoilers. But like even she's just like it's not something it's not an academic thing. I don't talk to people in academia about it, even though it's like these are sometimes the most impactful, important events in our life.
Which is so interesting because this has consistently happened. When we turn off the cameras, people suddenly share some other stuff. And we're like, wait, we should have filmed that. Because especially academics feel the need to act very... I don't think she was doing this.
Enlightenment.
I think she... Yeah,
thinking,
but like...
Right. Me too.
myself as well. Like, I want to be taken seriously. And so, you don't talk about those experiences. And just because you have those experiences don't mean you think they're true. Like, can't we even just talk about the experience on a phenomenological level? It doesn't mean therefore I believe fairies are real, but like, let's at least talk about our experiences and be open about those things.
Yeah, seriously. Like, I mean, that's kind of what the inspiration for this whole podcast is, right? Getting these things out in the open, talking about these. Our very first episode, or one of our first episodes, we're bringing on scientists to talk about what would it mean for Christians if aliens were discovered. Another type of intelligence that might be out there where no one looks at you if you're crazy if they're aliens,
Yeah.
but they do if they're if they're not ETs, then they're demonic or angelic, right? That's medieval, but aliens is somehow gets a bit more of a pass.
Well, and aliens are kind of the perfect thing, because aliens, I mean, whenever we talk about aliens, they end up inevitably anthropomorphic, right? Even if they're exaggerations, they have bigger brains than us or something, they're still very human-like. And yet we still think it's rational that other life might exist on other planets that's somehow similar to our own. And it's not just a projection, right? So
one way, long and short of it, Satan exists and Jonathan is his minion.
And Seth, I don't have anything.